another thing that I have a trouble with, which has to do with the issue of assimilation, or at least I assume that it bears on this issue of assimilation to a Western mindset and to adaptation to it, is the ability to take into consideration an ideal situation and say, how would things be if they were ideal, and therefore how should I act on the basis of my supposition of what is or isn't an ideal situation, in relation to my worldview and what seems to be going on, but I disagree with somehow, and I distance myself from somehow. This very intellectualized, very abstract modality of being. Now, I'm no stranger to the intellect, and I am, to a fault, very, very abstract in my own thinking, and it has been actually a struggle to assimilate my abstract views and constructs with my feeling and emotion and visceral sense of being. I have found that the two sides of me have tended to be split asunder, and that was a real problem that I had during my 20s. I really did become totally dissociated from my base level of being, from my emotion, from my passion, from my sensations. And I operated in a mode of trying to understand and ascertain things very abstractly, which was actually doomed for failure, because the more I moved into that modality, separated from myself, the more I lost any sense of the ability to recuperate myself, and I was actually succumbing to a autoimmune disease during that process of intellectualizing and separating from my earlier African sense of being. It took a lot of effort and a lot of Nietzscheanism, a lot of trial and error to bring my mind back in tune with my body. As Nietzsche says, the body has its own form of wisdom. In my case, succumbing to the autoimmune issue of leaky bowel syndrome and chronic fatigue syndrome, and really, really an extreme physiological vulnerability, taught me the need to bring myself back in touch with passion, emotion, and a very different concept of being than what I had been indulging in or trying to adapt to, depending on how you look at it. So there it is. But I think that the Western mode, the contemporary Western mode, it tends to be abstracted from being. It tends to say, well, in an ideal situation, and then we are supposed to react within a social situation or a general situation that we find ourselves in, on the basis of our moral pre-reckonings of what would have been more ideal and how we should like to see things, rather than how they are, how we would like to turn things into being, into existing, rather than how things are. And so the psychologist, she said to me yesterday, in an ideal situation, the family would be such and such, and so generally there wouldn't be sort of narrow control, or generally people could have some freedom, and it would be reassuring, and the parents would support you, and of course that would be an ideal situation. But I can't help but say it's too little too late to posit at this point in my life an ideal situation. Yes, it would have been ideal had my family been a different group of people, and it would have been ideal had I not had to deal with certain prejudices within Western culture. It would all have been ideal. One of the other reasons, though, when I listen to some talk about an ideal situation, is that I have a very primeval, very basic, very fundamental level of awareness that there is no ideal situation for women. I find female physiology is the reason why there's, in my experience, no ideal situation for women. It's like, to me, the female reproductive system is exactly equivalent to a incendiary device or grenade buried in your belly, and it will finally, predictably explode and mess with you totally. It's an incendiary device, and so to me, it's a very suspicious thing to say that there's an ideal situation for women. I think that's what makes me a different sort of feminist. I I can't imagine life being peaceful or any kind of pacifist notion, because to me the fundamental female situation is a grenade. It's an explosive device, and it's very, very suspicious. It's a very, very big question mark over life itself. It definitely assures no peace, no satisfaction in a predictable, harmonious, long-term way. It's an extreme violation to have a reproductive system of the female sort. It's very, very violent, very, very, very dangerous, very, very messy. I don't see any peace from it. So the type of feminists who say, well, women are more peaceful or more harmonious, I can't understand it at the very, very basic physiological level. And I also can't understand the idea that there is an ideal situation for the family. To me, the nuclear family is also in a similar vein to the reproductive system of women. Very violent, very messy, very cruel. It's not a harmonious situation, and it cannot be so. So in an ideal situation, could we have the exact opposite to what actually exists, or what seems to exist from my experience? I actually doubt it. Um, dear. But I think that there's a expectation in Western culture that we are to have this view and this attitude that we walk around talking about how a reality can be ameliorated, or how we would like to see things, and how we use our identity to create a betterment of things. And this attitude that there is a potential to ameliorate. I used to feel that way a little bit, but the Westerners themselves disabused me of that notion. I don't feel that way anymore, that we can ameliorate very much, because when you ask them to help you out with a thing or two, of course they're not available, never available, always available with recriminations, but never with actual forthcoming assistance. So I really don't buy into that improvement notion that they have very often. But I think you are supposed to walk around representing the ideal, like, I'm the ideal feminine woman. Here's how I conduct myself. Here's how I think you ought to do it. You can model yourself on me, and we will work toward creating this ideal family, or this ideal situation, on the foundation of, well, in my case, absolute violence and interior, physiological chaos, destruction, and disorder. But we'll create this nice harmony on top of it somehow. Yeah, I don't think so. I do hope I'm getting my point across here. It's probably not every woman's experience to have a very, very violent menstrual destructive chaos, but that was my familiar experience. Definitely in my 20s, it was like total destruction, total violence, like being electrocuted and stabbed at the same time for about 24 hours or 36. After 24, the electrocutions seem to stabilize a bit, but never comfortable. And on the basis of this construct of experiential reality, we're supposed to create a more peaceful, a more harmonious society than a warlike society, or than a society that is quintessentially masculine, or something like that. Anyway, it's just my sense of things that I'm very, very skeptical of that kind of a construct of some construct of the ideal. Never come across the ideal. Haven't been allowed to. When I do proclaim that I'm suffering in the way I'm describing in this video, or in other ways, people go, oh well, oh well. And then I'm supposed to play along with their idea of the ideal, the perfect harmonious family. I'm not even sure how I am supposed to do that. Cross the divide somehow, deny my pain, pretend it's all nice and harmonious, and then say, and a lovely family would be great too now, wouldn't it? Because all I see is violence. All I see is a big question mark over life. And so I'm not a traditional feminist, and I just have a level of personal experience and existential query that prohibits me absolutely from ever engaging in a feminine discourse.